Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to Urban Legends and Mythology. On this episode, we are discussing a figure who I've been waiting to discuss since Season 1, the infamous D.B. Cooper. This man is a legendary figure whom we actually know almost nothing about, because his infamy and his claim to fame only comes from one act, and that act was the hijacking of a Boeing 727 aircraft on November 24th, 1971, during which he leaps from the plane with over $200,000 in ransom money and disappears in the night skies somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, never to be seen or heard from again. Until this very day, 52 years later, we still have no clue who this guy was, what his motivations were, or if he even survived the experience. And over the course of these 50 years, the FBI would investigate, they would recreate the stunt, countless amateur investigators would look into this. There would be documentaries. Numerous individuals were suspected and still remain as persons of interest to this very day. And it remained an active investigation with the FBI up until July 2016, when they officially suspended the active investigation of the Northwest hijacking case, also known as Norjack. And it was the mystery of this unsolved investigation which really launches D.B. Cooper into the realm of urban legend and myth, because the whole case just leaves us with lingering questions to this day. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? Why didn't he actually spend any of the money? Did he even survive that jump that night? And if he did, where did he go? Which bears the question of, is that jump even survivable? And if he didn't survive that jump, what happened to his body? Why was it never found? And in an effort to try to answer all these questions and more, let's start where we always do, right at the beginning. Now, since we don't know who D.B. Cooper was, we can't really start at the beginning of his life, so I'm going to give you all the details of the hijacking as we know it. And these accounts come from the FBI investigation, the people who witnessed the event, the flight attendants, the pilots, and even accounts from people who came later and investigated it and spun off their own theories. So let's start on Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th, 1971. A somewhat unassuming man in his mid-40s walks up to the ticket counter of the Northwest Orient Airlines at Portland Airport. This man was described as having dark hair with brown eyes. He was wearing a black business suit, wearing a white shirt, a thin black clip-on tie, a black raincoat, and brown shoes, and was carrying an attaché case and a brown paper bag. The man then buys a one-way ticket on Flight 305, which was a 30-minute trip north to SeaTac, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The man paid with cash and was on his way. The name on the ticket was Dan Cooper. Now, this was the early 1970s, and airport security was virtually non-existent. It's not like the way it is today, where you have the TSA who feels the need to go through every belonging you have. They'll confiscate your lighters and your pocket knives and your toothpicks. And if you're somewhat attractive, one of those perverts in the TSA will find an excuse to grope you. Because don't forget, TSA stands for Tactical Sexual Assault. But I digress. So in 1971, your belongings weren't searched when you were put on a plane. You didn't have to walk through a metal detector. You just basically bought your ticket and boarded the plane. So our guy, Mr. Dan Cooper, he boards Flight 305, which was a Boeing 727-100, and he takes his seat. And he takes his seat in the very last row before you get to that kind of area where the stewardesses sit. His specific seat was seat 18E, so right behind his seat was the wall, and on the other side of that wall was the rear-facing jump seat that the stewardesses sit in. So this is where he's at on the plane, and he chooses this seat for a very specific reason, which will come up later. So he takes his seat, he settles in, and he orders a bourbon and a 7-Up from the flight attendant. Now, there's a total of 36 passengers on this plane, along with 3 flight attendants and the 3 guys in the cockpit. Seems like it's just going to be a routine short flight, so it takes off on time, on schedule at 2:50 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and it's due to arrive in Seattle at around 3:20. And so far, nothing out of the ordinary has occurred. It just seems like a normal routine flight. However, shortly after takeoff, Cooper hands a note to the flight attendant who's sitting in the jump seat right behind him, a woman named Florence Schaffner. Now, Florence, thinking that, oh, this is just some phone number from another lonely businessman looking to hook up with a stewardess, just slips the note in her purse and doesn't think anything of it. Of course, upon noticing this, Cooper, he leans towards her and he whispers, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." So Schaffner opened the note, and in neat, all capital letters printed with a felt tip pen, Cooper had written, quote, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase and I want you to sit by me." End quote. Schaffner then returned the note to Cooper, sat down as he requested, and quietly asked to see the bomb. He opened his briefcase just for a few seconds to show her 2 rows of 4 red cylinders, which she assumed was dynamite. Attached to the red cylinders were a wire and a large cylindrical battery, which appeared to resemble some kind of a bomb. Cooper then closes the briefcase and tells Schaffner his demands. She writes down these demands and delivers the demands to the cockpit and informs the flight crew of what's going on. Now, upon hearing these demands, the captain of the flight, a man named William Scott, directed her to remain in the cockpit for the remainder of the flight and take notes of the events as they unfolded. He then contacts Northwest Flight Operations in Minnesota and relays the hijacker's demands. And the demands were as follows: $200,000 in a knapsack by 5 p.m., and that money was to be in negotiable American currency, so essentially bundles of 20s. It's kind of a trope in American ransom situations. They always want small, unmarked, non-sequential, already circulated American bills, because they usually think if they do it this way, the money would be untraceable, so I kind of get it. He also demands 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes, so to this, it implies that he was going to take somebody else with him on this jump, most likely a hostage. But on his end, it's also a smart tactic, because by implying that he's going to take a hostage with him, he knows that he's not going to get defective or inoperable equipment. So with Schaffner still secured in the cockpit, another flight attendant, a woman named Tina Mucklow, is told to go sit by Cooper and act as a liaison between him and the other 4 now in the cockpit. And upon sitting next to him, he started to make additional demands, and this is the point where he's starting to lay out his overall plan. So the first part of it was, as the plane was to land in Seattle, the fuel trucks were to meet the plane, and all the passengers must remain seated while she, Mucklow, brought the money aboard. At that point, he would release the passengers, and then Mucklow was to go back out and bring the 4 parachutes aboard. So in the meantime, Captain Scott informs the Seattle-Tacoma Airport, the air traffic control, of the situation, who contacted the local police and FBI. The passengers were then told that their arrival in Seattle would be delayed because of a minor mechanical difficulty, which I guess makes sense. I believe that a rapid unscheduled disassembly would fall under the umbrella of a minor mechanical issue. So for the next 2 hours, Flight 305 just circles Puget Sound in order to give the Seattle police and the FBI sufficient time to assemble Cooper's ransom money and his parachutes. It was also to gather up any emergency personnel in case that rapid unscheduled disassembly took place thanks to Cooper's mechanical issue. So while all this is happening, the president of Northwest Orient, a man named Donald Nyrop, he authorizes the payment of the ransom and orders all employees to cooperate with the hijacker and comply to his demands. So while the plane is circling Seattle, Mucklow is chatting with Mr. Cooper, and she goes on to say in later years that the hijacker's demeanor was not nervous. He actually seemed rather nice and was not cruel or nasty in any way. So they're sitting there and they're having their little chat, and at one point Mucklow asked Cooper why he picked Northwest Airlines to hijack. He actually laughed and replied, "It's not because I have a grudge against your airlines, it's just because I have a grudge." He then goes on to explain that this flight simply seemed to have suited his needs at this particular time. He then goes on to ask where she's from, and she says that she's originally from Pennsylvania, but she's living in Minneapolis at this time, to which he responded that Minnesota was, quote, very pretty nice country. She also said that he appeared familiar with the local terrain. While looking out the window, he remarked, "Looks like Tacoma down there." He also at one point mentions that McChord Air Force Base was only a 20-minute drive from SeaTac Airport, which turned out later to actually be a true statement. At one point, she eventually asks where he's from, and at this point, he became kind of upset and he just decided he didn't want to answer. At this point, he kind of deflects the question. He just asks her, "Do you smoke?" And he hands her a cigarette, to which she replies she had just recently quit, but she accepted the cigarette anyway. To which he probably said something along the lines of, "Well, I guess you could use a cigarette after the events of today." Now, at one point, as the plane was maintaining its holding over Seattle, the FBI notes that he also spoke to another unidentified passenger. And this comes from an FBI account of this other passenger that they interviewed at the time named George Labissaner. He said that he visited the restroom directly behind Cooper on several occasions, but after one visit, he said the path to his seat was blocked by another passenger who was wearing a cowboy hat and questioning Mucklow about the supposed mechanical issue which was delaying them. Now, Labissaner said that Cooper was initially amused by the interaction, but then he became irritated at the constant questioning and literally got up and told the cowboy to return to his seat. Now, the cowboy ignored him, but eventually Mucklow was able to convince the cowboy to return to his seat. Now, this account kind of differs from Mucklow's version of the interaction. She said that a passenger approached her and asked for a sports magazine to read because he was bored, and the passenger and her moved to an area directly behind Cooper where, the stewardesses all had their little cubby hole or whatever. And while they're sitting there looking for the magazines, the guy comes across an issue of the New Yorker. He takes it and he returns to his seat. Upon returning to her seat, D.B. Cooper tells Mucklow, "If that's a sky marshal, I'll have no more of that." Now, despite all this, everything just kind of goes, and then they end up landing in Seattle. So they land in Seattle, and the $200,000 ransom was received from the Seattle First National Bank in a bag weighing approximately 19 pounds, because it was all fucking 20s. And I actually work in a industry where I literally handle 20s all day long, and $200,000 in 20s does sound like a nightmare to have to count through. And 19 pounds sounds about right. I mean, that is literally 10,000 $20 bills. So what the hijacker didn't know, or possibly found out later, was that that money was all photographed on microfilm by the FBI before it even made it to that plane. And this was done in order to get the serial numbers so they could track where this money went. And they would essentially track this money by basically just releasing all those serial numbers to the media and saying, "Hey, if you accept a bill, a $20 bill with this following serial number or whatever, then that money was involved in this hijacking, and if you bring it to us along with a description of like where you got it, that will help us find this hijacker." And they would use this tactic to also kind of incentivize the public to keep an eye out for these bills by offering rewards and stuff for turning in these bills along with any information associated with them. And most of these serial numbers would be easy to find because they all start with the letter L, which indicated issuance by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. However, later in the story, we will find that almost none of this money has ever been recovered. Probably because, snitches get stitches and wind up in ditches. But I digress. And just to show how much control this guy was in at this point, this is what happens when they actually get to the airport. So at 5:24 Pacific Standard Time, Captain Scott was informed that the parachutes and the money had been delivered to the airport. Upon receiving that message, the captain notifies Cooper that they would be landing soon, if that's okay with him. So at 5:46 p.m., Flight 305 lands at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, and with Cooper's permission, Scott parks the aircraft on a partially lit runway away from the main terminal. Once the plane comes to a stop, Cooper demanded that only one representative of the airline approach the plane with the parachutes and the money, and that the only entrance and exit would be allowed through the aircraft's front door via the mobile stairs. And this is kind of the reason why he chooses that seat in the back, because he can see everything that's going on in that cabin. So Northwest Orient Seattle operations manager, a man named Al Lee, he was designated to be the courier, which I'm sure he was ecstatic about. The poor guy probably drew the short straw at that meeting. So Al Lee actually changes into civilian clothes out of fear that Cooper might mistake his uniform as that of a uniform of an officer officer or something. And as he's approaching the airplane with all the passengers seated and the ground crew getting the little mobile stairs up there, Mucklow goes out, she meets Al, she gets the money and brings it back to Cooper. And upon receiving this money, Cooper then agrees to allow the passengers to go free. So as they're disembarking, Cooper, he's sitting there and he's inspecting the money. And to be honest, he's probably just looking at it to make sure it's not just filled with newspaper, or it's not just a bunch of die packs, or there's any tracking devices in there or anything. So as Cooper's inspecting the money in an attempt to try to break the tension, Mucklow jokes, "Hey, can I have some of that money?" To which he throws her a big wad of 20s. She then hands it back to him saying, "Well, per our company policy, I have to reject it because they might think it's a tip and we're not allowed to accept tips. Because God forbid a corporation allow a worker to accept a tip from a customer. It's just a ridiculous practice. It even goes on today." So after the passengers disembark, only Cooper and the 6 crew members remained on board. Now, in accordance with Cooper's demands, Mucklow made 3 trips outside the aircraft to retrieve the parachutes and the money, which she brought to him at the rear of the plane. At this point, Schaffner comes out of the cockpit and approaches Cooper and asks if she can retrieve her purse, which was in the compartment right behind his seat, to which he readily agrees, joking, "I'm not going to bite you." So at this point, the other flight attendant, a woman named Hancock, she asks Cooper if the flight attendants were allowed to leave, to which he replies, "Whatever you girls would like." Upon hearing this, Schaffner and Hancock disembark the plane. Mucklow remains behind, though, because everybody still assumes that she's going to be his hostage in this whole situation. So after the other 2 flight attendants disembark, Mucklow comes back with the final parachute and hands him the instruction card, to which he throws it aside and says, "I don't need this." So at this point, they're just sitting there on the tarmac and they're waiting for the refueling truck to refuel the plane so they can take back off. However, some kind of weird mechanical issue was going on which caused a delay, so a second and a third truck were eventually brought in to finish the refueling process. Now, during this, Mucklow states that Cooper was complaining because the money was delivered in a cloth bag instead of a knapsack like he had instructed. So he decides to improvise. So one of the reserve parachutes was actually a practice parachute. It wasn't meant for a canopy to deploy. And realizing this, he takes out his pocket knife, he opens up that parachute, he cuts out the canopy, and he uses that to stash the money in, making an improvised knapsack, essentially. And at another point, while they're still sitting there on the tarmac waiting for the refueling process to end, an FAA official requested a face-to-face meeting with Cooper aboard the aircraft, a meeting which he obviously impromptly denied. He then becomes impatient, waiting for this refueling process to end, and he says, "Let's get this show on the road, this shouldn't take so long." And at this point, he gives the cockpit crew their new flight plan. They are to maintain a southeast course toward Mexico City at the minimum airspeed possible without stalling the aircraft, approximately 100 knots or 185 kilometers an hour or 115 miles per hour. He also specified that the landing gear must remain deployed, the wing flaps must be lowered 15 degrees, and the cabin must remain unpressurized for the duration of the flight. So the first officer on the flight, a man named Radczak, informed Cooper that this configuration limited the aircraft's range to about 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers, and that they would have to stop somewhere to do a second refueling. And after some discussion, they agree on the Reno Tahoe International Airport for the second refueling stop. Now, at this time, Cooper also demanded that the plane take off with its rear exit door open and the air stair descended, but this demand was outright rejected by Northwest's home office because they determined that that was just way too unsafe. This is already a weird configuration they're flying in. Now, Cooper did counter by saying, well, it can be done, but he quickly dropped the point and said, screw it, I'll do it in flight, showing that he had some specific knowledge about this aircraft which wasn't really available to civilians at this time, but I digress. So at around 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 takes off with only Cooper, Mucklow, Captain Scott, First Officer Radczak, and the flight engineer, a man named Anderson, aboard. And unbeknownst to Cooper, 2 F-106 fighters from the nearby McChord Air Force Base and a Lockheed T-33 trainer were ordered to follow this plane. And these 3 jets maintain S flight patterns in order to stay behind this slow-moving 727 and out of Cooper's view. So the plane takes off, and not Not long after takeoff, Cooper tells Mucklow to lower the aft stairs. However, she tells Cooper that she fears that she would be sucked out of the aircraft if she did, and she asks if she can return to the cockpit, which Cooper refuses. And upon hearing this, the flight crew requests that she comes back to the cockpit to retrieve some emergency rope, to which Cooper refuses this. He says that he doesn't want her returning to the cockpit, and he doesn't want them coming out of the cockpit back to where he was. She then asks if he could cut a piece of paracord off of the parachute to act as kind of like a safety line, to which he says, you know what, screw it, go back to the cockpit, I'll do it myself. And he instructs her to go to the cockpit, close the curtain partition between the coach and first class sections, and do not return. Now, before she left, she begged Cooper, please take the bomb with you, to which he just coldly responded, I would either disarm it or take it with me. As she walked to the cockpit and turned to close the curtain partition, she saw Cooper standing in the aisle, tying what appeared to be the money bag around his waist. Now, from takeoff to when she entered the cockpit, only about 4 or 5 minutes had elapsed. However, she spent the rest of the flight to Reno in the cockpit, and she was the last person to ever see the hijacker. Now, right around 8 p.m., a cockpit warning light flashed, indicating that the aft staircase had been deployed, and the pilot used the cabin's intercom to ask Cooper if he needed assistance, and Cooper responded with his last message, a one-word reply, no. Then, at approximately 8:13 p.m., the aircraft's tail section suddenly pitched upward, forcing the pilots to trim and return the aircraft to level flight. This sudden pitching of the aircraft was a result of the hijacker, D.B. Cooper, jumping off of the aft staircase into the dark skies above the Pacific Midwest below. D.B. Cooper was never seen nor heard from again. However, at this time, the aircrew were unsure if he had actually jumped. They didn't know whether or not he was still on board. So they followed orders. They remained in the cockpit and remained a flight course in this configuration to Reno. Now, as they were approaching Reno, assuming he was still on board, Mucklow used the cabin intercom to inform Cooper that they were approaching and that he needed to raise the stairs so the plane could land safely. However, this was met with no reply, so they repeated it a few times, and every time it was met with no reply. So at 11:02 p.m., with the aft staircase still deployed, Flight 305 landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport. And at this time, FBI agents, state troopers, sheriff's deputies, and the Reno police established a perimeter around the aircraft because they don't know if this guy's still on board or not. And fearing that he was still on board and might detonate this bomb at any minute, they didn't approach the plane. So after a few minutes, Captain Scott, he decides that he's just going to search the cabin. He searches the cabin and he finds no signs of Cooper. After this, the FBI bomb squad comes aboard, and after a 30-minute search, they declare that the cabin is safe. And this launches the subsequent 45-year-long investigation into the mystery of what happened to the infamous D.B. Cooper. We know that he jumped off the back of that plane somewhere near Portland, and we know that he was never seen nor heard from again. But what we don't know was his identity, his motives, and whatever happened to him. So in this next segment, I'm going to briefly go into some of the details of the FBI investigation that followed. We're going to go through the evidence, and we're going to look into some possible suspects, and we're going to try to determine what happened in the immediate aftermath of this incident. And then I'm going to do something that I have never done before on this show. I am actually going to discuss my top 3 suspects in this case, and I'm going to discuss why I believe each one may be a potential candidate for who is the real D.B. Cooper. But let's quickly get into the FBI case, because that case begins immediately after that plane is cleared by the FBI bomb squad. So right from the beginning, D.B. Cooper actually leaves us a series of clues. So during the search of the plane, the FBI agents recovered Cooper's black clip-on tie, which still had the tie clip attached to it. And for those who don't know, because my god, casual wear has just ruined our planet, a tie clip is that little metal clip that goes on a tie that holds it in place so it doesn't flop around everywhere. They were also able to recover 66 latent fingerprints, some cigarettes that the man had smoked, some hair follicles which had stuck to the back of his seat, as well as 2 of the 4 parachutes that he left behind. So immediately the FBI are interviewing the eyewitnesses and they start gathering these composite sketches. So you think with all this evidence that we had, we'd be able to catch him, right? Well, no. For one, this was the 70s and DNA profiling was still about 20 years off. 2, fingerprinting only works if you have another set of the same fingerprints to compare it to, for example, the suspects. And 3, while facial composite sketches can get us a general idea of what the person looks like, our memories are generally fuzzy at best. And during a time of high stress, like a skyjacking, for example, our memories might not be able to pick up on maybe certain facial features. And a lot of those composite sketches end up being close, but not quite. For example, over the course of the investigation, over 900 people would be suspected, and a lot of them would be ruled out simply because they didn't quite match the composite sketch for one reason or another. So due to the fact that our memories just aren't perfect, we have to take composite sketches with a grain of salt and realize that there is some leeway there. And simply due to the fact that some suspects were eliminated simply because they don't perfectly match the composite sketch, I believe that that led to them discounting the actual subject, and that actual subject was able to get away. However, I am getting ahead of myself. I'll get to that later. And to be honest, it would actually be a series of blunders and missteps which I believe led the FBI down all these rabbit holes, which led to certain biases being formed, which resulted in this case never being solved. Now, I'm not saying the FBI investigators were idiots. However, they did kind of gloss over some glaring red flags, and they discounted suspects who just simply didn't fit their version of the narrative. Now, first and foremost, due to a number of variables and parameters, precisely defining the area where to search for the landing zone was extremely difficult. For one, they had no idea how long he remained in freefall before he pulled that ripcord, which could create a big, wide area for the LZ to be. 2, due to some kind of rough weather conditions, they weren't entirely sure exactly where they were when he jumped. And this was a huge wooded area they had to search. And despite the FBI's attempts to retrace the flight path and even recreate the jump by throwing a sledge out the back of the plane in flight, they were never able to actually determine where that landing zone was. They had a general rough idea of where it was, but that was all they had. Of course, from the very beginning, this was flawed because from the very beginning, a lot of FBI agents and other agencies, police officers, whatever, they believed that he did not survive this jump out of the back of this 727. They were almost 100% convinced from the beginning that he was an amateur and he died upon impact, or that he maybe never even got the chute open. They also had the assumption that even if he were to have survived this and landed in the forest somewhere, that he would still be somewhere very close by, probably along the flight path. Like, for example, they were doing door-to-door searches of all the houses in the area in the days afterwards. Just doesn't make sense. Anybody with a brain would know that he would have been long gone shortly after he landed if he hadn't died on impact. So they waste a lot of time, like over a year and a half, just kind of searching this general area, just looking for the LZ or a body, just based on the assumption that he didn't survive the jump. However, that was just one part of the search, because a month after the hijacking, the FBI distributed lists of the ransom serial numbers to places like financial institutions, casinos, racetracks, banks, any place that conducted large cash transactions, in an attempt to see if any of the money would turn up. And the reason they were targeting these businesses were the fact that they were businesses in which money laundering was common. And the FBI assumed that he he would, in the days or months or maybe even years after coming into all this money, that he would launder it through one of these type of financial institutions. However, this would come to be a dead end, and for several reasons. For one, no business wants to be known as the business where a skyjacker went and laundered all the money. So even if they knew they had the money, they're not going to release that to the FBI, especially someplace like a Las Vegas casino in the 70s. I mean, honestly, do you think those mob-run casinos back in the 70s wanted the feds within 100 miles of Las Vegas? No. Plus the fact they had assumed, once again, that this guy would just naturally go somewhere and launder this money through one of these institutions, when in reality, the guy, if he was spending the money, was probably spending it discreetly and in small amounts. And at this time, outside of these institutions, the public doesn't yet know of these serial numbers. That information wouldn't be released until early 1972. So he had a few months already to get rid of some of this money without anybody ever knowing that it was the money associated with the hijacking. And furthermore, and I just know this because I work in a financial institution, I handle money all day long, nobody's sitting there paying attention to the serial numbers. To be honest, we're primarily just checking all the characteristics to make sure it's not counterfeit. And to be honest, the general other reason why, if that money was spent in the economy and nobody ever came forward, was simply because they didn't want the fucking feds in their business. I mean, let's just say you go into a bank and you withdraw money out of your account and you end up getting one of these 20s that was from this ransom, and you, for whatever reason, I don't know, you were bored one day and you were just kind of like reading that newspaper article where they released all these serial numbers and are talking about the hijacking. You flip through your 20s and you realize that you have one. Is your first thought really going to be, oh, I need to call the feds and report this, I got this from this bank? Most likely you're not. You're most likely just going to think, oh, that's really cool, I'm going to keep this as a souvenir. Or you think, if I do contact the feds, they're probably going to drag me in for questioning. Or if you're like most people, you probably would think nothing of it and just end up spending that money down the chain in the economy until that bill is eventually retired and destroyed. Because in the United States, most bills only really stay in circulation for about 10, if you're lucky, maybe 15, 20 years before it's so worn out it's just shredded by a financial institution. That's why it's so cool if you find like a dollar bill or a $5 bill from like the 1960s, or hell, I have one from the 1930s, a silver certificate. You end up kind of holding on to that for a long time and keeping it in your little collection of like cool coins and currencies or whatever. Everybody has one. And like I said, the general populace, they don't sit around and just stare at the serial numbers of their money. So I'm sure that when the feds did release these serial numbers to the public, there probably was a little bit of a rush because it was kind of like winning the lottery. You know, do I have one of these bills? But I imagine even that didn't really last more than maybe a few days, and most people didn't even bother to check their currencies to see if any of these bills had ever turned up in their hands. However, this did lead to a kind of humorous counterfeiting case where two men used a bunch of these numbers to print up some counterfeit $20 bills. And they were able to swindle something around like $30,000 from this Newsweek reporter in exchange for an interview who they claimed was the hijacker. Now, I don't know whatever became of that, but I'm sure that Newsweek reporter probably wasn't a reporter for Newsweek for very long after that. So even with Northwest, Orient, and the FBI offering rewards for the return of any money that was possibly linked to this hijacking, nothing ever turned up. It's like that money just kind of vanished into thin air along with D.B. Cooper. And furthermore, the investigation was just turning up and dismissing suspects because there was no solid proof linking any of these suspects to the man himself. But let's not forget some of the other clues that were left behind on the plane and what became of those clues in the investigation around that. So we'll start with one of the more famous clues left behind on the plane, the clip-on necktie. So the FBI agents actually did find a skinny black clip-on tie in C-18E where Cooper had been seated, and attached to this tie was a gold tie clip with a circular mother-of-pearl setting in the center of the clip. And once again, for you people out there who have never worn a suit or a tie in your lives, what's wrong with you people? A tie clip is that little skinny piece of metal that clips to your tie and your shirt so your tie doesn't flop around all over the place. Also, if you don't own at least one suit, and I don't care what you do for a living, if you don't own at least one suit, can you truly say that you take an ounce of pride in how you present yourself to the rest of the public, especially during formal occasions? But, this isn't a fashion podcast. Let's get back to the story. And the FBI had determined that that tie had been sold exclusively at JCPenney department stores, but had been discontinued in 1968. Now, that determination didn't actually lead anywhere, but I guess it's an interesting piece of trivia. It just suggests that at some point before 1968, this guy came into possession of a tie that he most likely bought at JCPenney. Big deal. However, by late 2007, the FBI was able to build a partial DNA profile from samples found on the tie back in 2001. So the tie had 3 samples of DNA. It had 2 small DNA samples and 1 large sample. However, they admitted it was difficult to draw firm conclusions from these samples, which basically meant they have no freaking clue who this DNA profile belonged to, because here's the thing with DNA, it's a lot like fingerprints. You can have somebody's DNA on file, but if you don't actually have that person in front of you so you can compare the DNA, or if you don't have like a member of that immediate family that you can compare the DNA to, then it's useless. A lot of people think that, we just have to get a DNA sample and we can solve the case. Well, that's not how it works. You gotta have something to compare that sample to, and if you have someone whose DNA is not on file with anyone anywhere, then your DNA evidence is useless because you have nothing to compare it to, especially if you have absolutely no clue who the suspect is. But something more interesting did come from the investigation into this tie, and what was found here actually strengthens my hypothesis of who D.B. Cooper was. That'll come up later. So in March 2009, there was this group of citizen sleuths who called themselves the Cooper Research Team, and they were investigating this case, and they get a hold of the tie, and through using electron microscopy, they were able to find and analyze and identify hundreds of organic and metallic particles on Cooper's tie. So far a big deal, right? It's a tie, it's gonna have hundreds of organic and metallic compounds on it, but it was some of these metallic compounds that they found that led to something very specific. They found minute particles of unalloyed titanium, along with particles of bismuth, antimony, cerium, strontium sulfide, aluminum, and titanium antimony alloys. Now, what's so important about these metals? Why do we care? Well, the metal and the alloy particles suggested that Cooper may have worked in the airline industry, in the manufacturing part of it, because these rare earth metals, especially unalloyed titanium, which was the majority of the particles found, was very rare and only being used in that industry at this time. They believe that Cooper worked in the airline industry, or the airline fabrication industry, specifically with Boeing, the very manufacturer of our 727. And since the 727 was kind of the workhorse of domestic travel during the 1970s, it's not a wild leap to suggest that he worked very closely with these aircrafts. But we did have some hard clues which directly linked us to the man and could have identified the man if the FBI hadn't pulled another one of their blunders and lost them. One thing the FBI was able to get a hold of, and actually had a hold of for years before they lost it, were 2 hair samples. There were actually 2 strands of hair found. One strand of hair from the head of a Caucasian man, it was a brown hair, and another from a limb, probably the arm hair, of the same man. Now, the limb hair was actually destroyed after the FBI crime laboratory determined that the sample lacked enough unique microscopic characteristics to be useful, so that makes sense. Now, the head hair was determined to be viable and contain enough information for future investigation, and it was actually placed on a microscopic slide. However, in between this time and 2002, when they were trying to build D.B. Cooper's DNA profile, that sample had just been lost. It was just lost. It was gone. They had no idea what happened to it. And the same thing happens to these cigarette butts that they found. Now, D.B. Cooper was a heavy smoker. They estimated that he smoked at least a pack a day. And in the armrest ashtray of the seat he was sitting in, they found 8 Raleigh-tipped cigarette butts. These were sent to the FBI crime laboratory to search for fingerprints because they didn't have DNA back then. However, no fingerprints were able to be lifted off of these cigarette butts. And the FBI, they just returned the cigarette butts to the Las Vegas field office. And at some point between the 1970s and 1998, when the FBI sought them out in order to get DNA, they had discovered that the cigarette butts had been destroyed by the Las Vegas field office for whatever reason. Now, this is all well and good. Yeah, you're trying to get DNA evidence, but it's like I said, you can build a DNA profile, but if you have no one to compare that profile to, then you're just taking swings in the dark. However, on February 10th, 1980, an event would take place which would lead the FBI down this further path in their theory that the guy had died. Because on that date, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family on the Columbia River, and this is about 9 miles downstream of Vancouver, Washington. And as he was raking the sandy riverbank in order to create a fire, he actually uncovered 3 packets of the ransom money. And all in all, it totaled around $5,800 of the money. Now, upon finding this money and turning it into the FBI, there was kind of a renewed interest in the case, and this frenzy went on, and all these people were like going out to the Columbia River on the weekends and stuff, digging around trying to find the rest of this money. You know, it was like a big treasure hunt, and then the FBI was like, well, if this money is washing up on this riverbed, then he had to have died. But ultimately, it sparks the question of how did the money get there? Was it buried? Did it land in the water and just wash up on shore? And there's geologic evidence and hydrologic evidence that kind of go both ways. And I think ultimately they came up with the hypothesis that somehow the money entered the water several months after the hijacking. It didn't just fall into the water immediately, nor did it just kind of get buried dry and then kind of washed out due to erosion. Now, what I personally think happened is something that no one ever seems to talk about, and I don't know why because it seems obvious to me. At some point, either while he was landing or after he landed in that area, they probably fell out of his little improvised knapsack without him noticing, and those bundles probably sat in the woods for a very long time until they were eventually washed into the Columbia River, maybe by a storm or something. However, this is the only ransom money that would ever be found in this case. As I said earlier, I believe this guy, he had a little bit of a lead ahead of the FBI. You know, it was a couple of months before they even released the serial numbers of the bills to the public. I believe within those first few days or weeks or even months, he had already deposited that money somewhere, spent that money somewhere. It wound up back into the economy, getting shifted around from person to person, financial institution, financial institution. You know how a $20 bill is. It goes everywhere. It's the most widely accepted currency in the United States. And I don't think it was ever recovered because I think it just ended up like all spent bills. They end up at a warehouse being shredded and recycled. And all this finally brings us to the subject of the jump. Did he survive that jump? I personally believe he did. The FBI believes he didn't. And the FBI believed for a very long time, despite all evidence to the contrary, that this guy was an amateur parachutist who had very little to no knowledge of this jump. They said that he was crazy to perform a jump like this. They thought it was impossible to survive just based on the weather conditions and the speed and the terrain. And that inherent bias even runs to this day. There are people that think, oh, there's no way this guy was a professional or trained in any way. But the evidence presented from day one showed that this guy knew exactly what he was doing, because even Mucklow said that when he was putting on the parachute, he seemed very familiar with it. It was like he was putting on a pair of pants. And he specifically wanted a military style parachute, which shows that he was familiar with this style of parachute as opposed to the kind of sports style parachutes with the larger canopies. And even in a May 1973 8-page suspect profile that suggested that he was familiar with military-style parachutes and possibly had military-style jump training. However, the lead investigator on the case from the day it started up until like 1980 continued to believe that the guy was just a total amateur. He even said that in like a 2014 interview that he still didn't believe that Cooper had any knowledge of how to operate a parachute or do this jump. But the thing is, literally anyone who's been through a military jump school will tell you that this is a survivable jump. This is an easy jump to make, and people have repeated this jump on many occasions. There are actually skydiving academies or skydiving schools or excursions or whatever, and they have Boeing 727s in their private fleets, and you can pay extra money to literally do the DB Cooper jump. And it's really not that crazy of a jump. A lot of people exaggerate it because of weather conditions or speeds or whatever, but they exaggerate those speeds. Remember, the plane was only going 100 knots. 100 knots is only 115 miles per hour, or for my international listeners, about 160 kilometers per hour. Now, the average speed of a sports style skydiving jump, which anybody can go to do, you can literally pay to do it, is only around 90 miles per hour. So it's just slightly faster than your average skydiving jump. He just had to keep the 727 at 100 knots to prevent it from stalling out. And in the military, in jump school, you're usually jumping a little bit faster than that. You're usually jumping at around 100 to 125 miles per hour, just depending on certain factors. And then they say, well, what about terrain? He could have gotten hung up in a tree or something. And the thing is, if you're a total and complete amateur, yeah, that's going to be scary, the thought of like hanging in a tree or something. But people who go through jump school, especially if they do it in the military, they are taught to land in all kinds of terrains, mountains, the forests, desert. Hell, they're taught what to do if they do land in water. They'll jump into anything, sometimes with up to 150 pounds of equipment on their backs. So the thought that this was an impossible, unsurvivable jump by a total amateur just flies out the window. And in fact, we can clearly see by the suspect profile that this is a guy who thought tactfully. He remained calm the entire time. He knew how to act in a high pressure situation. He was familiar with the airline. He was familiar with the parachutes. And he was obviously a methodical planner, probably genius level intelligence. And I think it's entirely within the realm of possibility that this guy had jump experience, probably military jump school experience. Which leads us to our final segment, my top 3 picks for who I believe DB Cooper most likely was. Now, to start off with, there have been over 1,000 people who had been suspected in this case. So weeding through them all is a very daunting task. However, in weeding through most of them, you could easily discount them on various factors. Some of them are just whack jobs who claim to be DB Cooper, however they knew nothing about any of the evidence or the case itself. A lot of people were eliminated very quickly just because they had alibis or they didn't fit the profile or whatever. So it is very hard to narrow it down to a list of 3, but I'm going to get right into it. So my first candidate is a man named Ted Braden. Now, Ted Braden, he led a really crazy and kind of awesome life. So he was born Theodore Burdett Braden Jr. in 1928, and he was a Special Forces commando during the Vietnam War. And what makes him really cool is he was born in Ohio, greatest state in the nation, fight me on it. Now, Braden was a hardcore dude from an early age. He actually joined the military at the age of 16 in 1944, and he served with the 101st Airborne. And they are an elite hardcore group of motherfuckers who specialize in air assault operations. Wait, I don't think that definition's right because there's airborne and there's air assault, and I think the air assault guys are the ones that like rappel out of helicopters, where the airborne guys like, you know, they parachute in. If anybody wants to chime in and clarify that for me, definitely do so in the comments. So Braden, he joins the 101st Airborne right towards the end of World War II, and he eventually becomes one of the military's leading parachutists, often representing the Army in international skydiving tournaments. He's listed as making somewhere like around 910 or 911 jumps. Now, during the 1960s, he was a team leader within the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations, and they were a classified classified unit of the Green Berets, which conducted unconventional warfare operations during the Vietnam War. Unconventional warfare operations basically means guerrilla warfare. These are the guys diving in behind enemy lines, doing sabotage missions, and conducting espionage, and probably engaging in certain acts which would make the Geneva Convention cringe. He also serves as a military skydiving instructor to Project Delta, who were tasked with kind of gathering reconnaissance intelligence, all that kind of information. Now, Braden, he spent a total of 23 months over there in between North and South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, conducting all these classified operations. However, in December 1966, he actually deserts his unit in Vietnam and made his way to the Congo to serve as a mercenary. And it's probably because at the time in the Congo, they were fighting commies, and he probably figured that he could make a buttload of money in joining this fight as a mercenary, as opposed to army pay, which, to be honest, has generally always been dog shit. Seriously, it is almost criminal how little we pay those men and women in our armed services to do those jobs. Meanwhile, our useless senators are getting lifetime pensions and are earning more in a year than most people earn in their lifetimes. But I digress. But he was only a mercenary there for a short time until he was tracked down and arrested by the CIA, who brings him back for court-martial for desertion. However, despite committing a capital offense, deserting during wartime, which can literally garner the death penalty due to his service record, and in exchange for him not blurting out all the secrets of these missions he was on, he was given an honorable discharge and simply barred from re-entering the military. Now, following his discharge from the military, his whereabouts and what he's doing for the rest of his life is relatively unknown. However, in interviewing some of his friends who knew him back from his Vietnam days, they said he was always involved in shady money-making schemes. But we do know at the time of the hijacking, he was a truck driver for Consolidated Freightways, which was headquartered in Vancouver, Washington, just across the Columbia River from Portland, and living not far from the supposed drop zone. Now, at some point in the early 70s, he was investigated by the FBI for stealing $250,000 during a trucking scam he advised. However, he was never charged in any crimes relating to that. Then in 1980, he was indicted by a federal grand jury for driving an 18-wheeler full of stolen goods from Arizona to Massachusetts. But in this case, I don't believe he was actually convicted. And then at some point in the late 80s, he ends up being sent to federal prison. However, it's not really clear as to why. So basically, here's a guy who fits the description of someone who would be perfectly suited in order to pull off a crime like this. He does have a criminal record, which is shown in his later life, and he's obviously familiar with the 727 and most likely familiar with this jump and probably performed this jump, because in Vietnam, we were using 727s to deploy soldiers behind enemy lines, and they were jumping out of these 727s by using the rear stairwell. And here's the thing, that ability to drop the rear stairwell in flight wasn't known to civilians or any random person off the street. Even the pilots that flew the plane didn't think that the aft stairwell could be dropped in flight. But somebody who had jump experience, who probably made that jump in Vietnam, who was very familiar with those planes, they would know exactly how to release that aft stairwell. And finally, if you look at his physical descriptions, he looks just like the sketches of D.B. Cooper. Roughly 5'8", 5'9", early 40s, which he was in his early 40s at this time. Highly intelligent, short dark hair, and a medium athletic build. However, while all that sounds exactly like the type of person who would have performed this jump and this crime, he's only in my number 3 for a few reasons. For one, he seems to have repeated a dumb pattern of behavior throughout the 70s and 80s, which landed him in hot water a lot of times, despite given how intelligent this man was. So anybody who got away with $250,000 in 1971 wouldn't continuously be doing these dumb schemes to make money, unless they were just doing it for the thrill of the whole thing, which some people allege. I don't think D.B. Cooper was doing it for the thrill of the whole thing. And the other reason why I don't think it was him was simply due to his personality and his demeanor, because his family members describe him as being the perfect combination of high intelligence and criminality, and his fellow soldiers describe him as being kind of reckless and cruel and, always throwing himself into danger. It doesn't really seem to be the demeanor of Cooper, who was seen as actually being a very polite skyjacker. I mean, for a very long time, and even to this day, people referred to him as the Gentleman Skyjacker. He also didn't really appear to be reckless in any way, as Braden is generally described as being. So while it's possible that Braden possessed the knowledge, the ability, and the skill to pull off the skyjacking, I personally just don't think it was him. My gut just tells me no. That's why he's number 3 on my list. But we'll never know. He died in 2007, and he didn't leave a deathbed confession saying, "I'm D.B. Cooper." And that brings us to our number 2 suspect, a man named Richard McCoy. Now, I'll be honest, Richard McCoy, he's only number 2 on my list for a number of reasons. I was going to put him lower on the list, but he's the only one on this list who had actually done this jump afterwards. And when he was gunned down by FBI agents at obviously the end of his life, the FBI agent who actually shot him literally said, "When I shot him, I shot D.B. Cooper." And when I say he made this jump afterwards, he actually, in 1972, committed the same crime. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's dig into who this guy was. So Richard McCoy Jr. was born in 1942. He was an Army veteran who served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, first as a demolition expert and later with the Green Berets as a helicopter pilot. So basically another elite badass combat veteran. And this guy was a true badass. He was awarded the Purple Heart in 1964. He was also later awarded the Army Commendation Medal and the Distinguished Flying Cross. And both of those medals are medals that are granted to people who had committed acts of heroism. So after his tours of duty in Vietnam, he returns to his home state of Utah, and he serves as a warrant officer in the Utah National Guard. He had also studied law enforcement at Brigham Young University, taught Mormon Sunday school, and it was purported that his dream was to become an FBI agent. Ironic considering how his life ended. So what really made McCoy a character of interest in the D.B. Cooper case was that on April 7, 1972, McCoy staged the best known of the so-called copycat hijackings. So on this date in Denver, Colorado, he boarded United Airlines Flight 855, which was a Boeing 727 with the same aft stairs. At some point during the flight, he brandishes what he claims to be a grenade. It later turned out to be a paperweight that looked like a grenade, and an unloaded handgun, and demanded $500,000 and some parachutes. So the plane lands at San Francisco International Airport, and McCoy ordered the aircraft back into the sky after he received the money and the parachutes. And at some point over Provo, Utah, he does that same D.B. Cooper-esque jump. Now, the FBI interest in this was super heightened. They were convinced that this guy was D.B. Cooper, and the FBI will state that he still remains one of their top suspects to this day. But unfortunately, he really doesn't fit the description. To be honest, the reason I put him on this list is because he pulled off one of the most successful copycat crimes, and the FBI is convinced that he was their guy. But if you look at the actual evidence, this guy was very sloppy compared to D.B. Cooper. For example, D.B. Cooper, he was methodical about gathering all the evidence that he could. He demanded all the notes back that he had written the flight attendants. He didn't even let them throw away his matchbook, and he kept a calm, cool, very quiet demeanor during the whole thing. Whereas McCoy seemed to be very sloppy in the whole thing. He actually left behind his handwritten notes on how to do the hijacking. He also left behind a magazine that he had been flipping through that was just covered in his fingerprints, something that Cooper would have never done. And to top it off, he was arrested only 2 days after the hijacking, because when he landed, he was still wearing the jump gear and carrying the duffel bag, and he was hitchhiking outside of this fast food restaurant and got a ride from a motorist who tipped off the FBI. He even later bragged to an accomplice about how easy it was to pull off this skyjacking, so the guy was kind of an idiot. So of course, very quickly he was arrested and he was sentenced to 45 years in prison for this. They even found the jumpsuit and duffel bag in his house when they came to arrest him. He was later incarcerated at the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, and he used his access to the prison's dental office to fashion a fake handgun out of dental paste. Then he and a crew of other convicts escaped on August 10, 1974 by commandeering a garbage truck and crashing it through the main gate. He remained on the lam for about 3 months, and then one day the FBI locates him in Virginia Beach, Virginia. It was actually on November 9th, 1974. McCoy walked into his home and was met by 3 FBI agents, or maybe 4, I don't remember. He immediately fired upon them, and then they returned fire, killing him. And it was when that FBI agent said that, when he shot him, he shot DB Cooper. So some of the feds were convinced at this point that, they got their man, they got Cooper. Myself, on the other hand, I don't see it, but as I said, he's so high on the list just simply because the feds thought they got their man when they killed him. Now, my number one suspect, the guy who I am convinced 100% is DB Cooper, was a man named Kenneth Peter Christensen. And he actually wasn't even suspected of this crime until after he died. And the FBI still claims to this day that there's no way Christensen was the guy. And while we have no direct evidence linking him to the hijacking, there is a ton of circumstantial evidence that links him to this hijacking. So Christensen, he enlists in the Army in 1944, and he was trained as a paratrooper, so that means he went to jump school and he knew how to do these jumps into everywhere. Now, before he was really deployed, the war comes to an end. However, he did make a bunch of training jumps while he was with the occupation forces in Japan. So the guy had jump experience, obviously, and to any paratrooper, this is an easy jump for them. So after leaving the Army in 1954, he actually joins Northwest Orient as a kind of jack-of-all-trades laborer, so he was like an extra set of hands. They called him unskilled laborers back then, so he was basically just that guy who showed up that day and they said, hey, go do this, and he went and did it. And a lot of this work involves stuff like working on airplanes, refueling airplanes, fixing airplanes, and as we recall, the basic workhorse of American airplanes at the time was the Boeing 727. So he would have known these planes upside down, inside out, and backwards. So Christensen, he gets this job and he's actually stationed at the Far East stopover on Shemya Island in the Aleutians up in Alaska. This was basically like a refueling point or a pit stop for airplanes that were flying that Orient route into like Japan and China at the time. However, as a laborer like this, he's really not making a lot of money. I mean, at some points, he's literally digging ditches for friends to make money. And he's like renting a room off of a guy for like $50 a month or something. So he decides, you know what, I'm gonna learn how to be a flight attendant. So he becomes a flight attendant and he's making a little bit more money and flying on mostly these international routes now. And then he takes that next step up and he becomes a purser. And he's flying that kind of Northwest Orient international route, usually to Japan and back. And a purser is a guy on a ship or an airplane who's basically responsible for handling money. And around the time he's doing this job, he's based in and around Seattle. And he actually ends up spending pretty much the rest of his life living in Washington. He actually later would buy property around Bonnie Lake. However, as a purser, he's still not making a very stable income. A lot of people say that he was probably making like $520 a month. And that's around the 1970s, which is like okay money, but not really a lot. But the big problem was with Northwest Orient, that pay wasn't stable because their nickname at the time was Cobra Airlines, because they were notorious notoriously for striking at the drop of a hat. And some of these labor strikes were very long and very protracted, and when you're a member of that union, that puts a lot of financial strain on you during those strikes. So while, yeah, you do have some times where you're doing good, you'll have long times where you're doing bad because you're mixed up in a labor dispute. And I think after a number of these labor disputes over the years, that gave him kind of a motive, because at one point, during the hijacking, he says, "I don't have a grudge against your airlines, I just have a grudge." It could be that he just had a general grudge against the labor union or his fellow employees, and this was his way of striking back at them. And while I admit the rest of this is very circumstantial, but it just seems to be kind of incredible and line up with a lot of things. So only 7 months after the hijacking, Kenny Christensen is still working at Northwest Orient for that same kind of mediocre pay, but all of a sudden he buys a house and some property. Now, while a lot of people allege that he paid for it in cash from that heist, the truth is he didn't. He actually managed to get himself a mortgage, and he pays the mortgage off over a period of the next 19 years. But it seems kind of odd that just before the hijacking, the guy was financially struggling, and then almost just a few months after the hijacking, he's financially stable, and he becomes financially stable for the rest of his life. And at a later point in his life, it's exposed that he has almost $200,000 in a bank account. Now, it could be that things were getting better for him and he was finally financially stable. However, that mortgage and that money seems to come out of nowhere. And then several years later, I think in the 80s or 90s, some kids actually playing on that property actually find a bundle of money. Now, this bundle of money wasn't the D.B. Cooper ransom money, but you suddenly have this guy who is generally broke. All of a sudden, you're finding money on his property. That's kind of weird. Now, here's the thing. Kenny, he was actually a very intelligent man. He was familiar with these 727s. He had jump experience, and he was the right age. And if you look at a photo of him and you overlay a photo of him over that most notorious sketch, he looks dead on, like D.B. Cooper. The only difference was his hairline recedes a little more, but he was known to wear a toupee. And also a photograph that his brother found that was taken shortly after the hijacking, it was actually found hidden behind another photo, shows Kenny Christensen dressed exactly like D.B. Cooper, carrying a large bag full of something, as well as an attaché case which he kept with him for the rest of his life, a black attaché case that matches the exact description of the one from the hijacking. And it gets even crazier. Kenny Christensen was a known smoker. He loved bourbon, which was the drink that the hijacker ordered, and he portrayed the same mannerisms and demeanor as the hijacker throughout his life. Even the guy's best friend in a 2014 interview believed that he was the hijacker, and even his own brother believed that he was the hijacker. Actually, it was his brother who brought all of this to the public attention as he was going through Christensen's personal effects after his death. Now, there's a lot of people who will say that there's no way Christensen was the hijacker, and they'll come out with some of the evidence like I've already mentioned. They'll say that, well, he mortgaged his property and he made his money after paying off his property and was able to sell some of it. He owned multiple acres of valuable property, and if he was the hijacker, why would he spend the next 25 years working with the airline? The guy's got $200,000 in the bank. And I would posit this question: if I were to do an inside job at the company I worked for and steal $200,000, would I instantly go out and quit my job and start flaunting around all the money? No, only an idiot does that. Would I use just a little bit of the money to maybe take care of some debts and secure a mortgage on a property that I pay off over a number of years and then kind of launder that money through my bank account gradually over a long period of time while still remaining that perfect employee that no one would ever suspect? That's precisely how D.B. Cooper would have done it. Remember, when he hijacked that plane, he didn't want to draw a lot of attention to himself. He didn't jump up and say, "I have a bomb," and panic everybody on board. He didn't instantly go out and flaunt a bunch of cash that would have resulted in him getting caught. Instead, he played the long game. He took advantage of the fact that no one was going to notice if he slipped some of these, ransom bills into his money over a long period of time, because who really looks at every serial number on their banknotes? He knew that even if the bank did somehow end up with some of these notes, they weren't going to go out and tell the feds about it. All that does is just just draw unwanted attention to your bank. And if your bank is your livelihood and you're losing money by reporting all this stuff to the feds, then you're not a very smart banker. So this is kind of my play-by-play of what I think happened. So Kenny Christensen, he's this paratrooper. He goes through the jump school of the U.S. military. With this training, he can jump into anything: mountains, trees, forests, deserts, water, whatever. Insert landscape here. After he gets out of the army, he goes and he works for this airline. However, the pay is sucky and, they're constantly striking, so that's eating into his paychecks. So he gets frustrated being pretty much broke all the time, and he goes and he advances in his career. He becomes a flight attendant and a purser because he thinks he's going to make more money. However, Cobra Airlines, they strike again. And maybe with this instability in his financial situation, he starts to develop a bit of a grudge against his co-workers and the union and Northwest Orient. So, he says, you know what, I'm going to get mine. You know what, I'm going to hijack this plane. I'm going to get $200,000 out of it. I'm going to disappear into the forests of the Northwest Pacific. They're not going to find me. They're not going to be able to track me. And then I'm going to show up at work on Monday just as shocked as everybody else. Meanwhile, I'm going to play the long game with this money. I'm going to slowly launder it through my bank accounts or whatever. Maybe get a mortgage, maybe get a house, maybe get some land. Nothing flashy, nothing crazy. And I'm going to live my life with a little bit of financial stability. And the FBI never suspects him. Why would they? He's a loyal employee. He's a hardworking guy with a job and a mortgage. He's not the guy we're looking for. He's not like drowning in debt like we assume. He's not the exact profile of the person we're looking for, even though if you overlay his photo over a photo of some of the sketches, he's a dead ringer. He's just a guy that kind of looks like the guy, just like the other 999 suspects we have, so I guess we'll just keep looking. Now, I do want to reiterate that, yes, all of the evidence against Christensen is circumstantial, and people have poked a lot of holes in the logic behind it, but I think there's something there. I think they discount the intelligence of this man. My personal opinion is it's him. He committed the perfect crime and was just intelligent enough to get away with it. But at the end of the day, D.B. Cooper, whoever he was, he lives in urban legend and in infamy. And while I don't condone crime or what he did, I still raise my beer to him because he was a badass for doing it. And that's really all I have to say about D.B. Cooper, which I must admit I'm glad for because this episode took 5 recording sessions to get through. I'm pretty convinced that after I edit this thing, it's going to be my longest ever episode. But this mystery is just one of the more fascinating mysteries that came out of the second half of the 20th century, especially when you consider the fact that it was never solved. The FBI kind of shelved it in 2016, and that was mostly due to a complete lack of hard evidence to link this crime with anybody. Now, they did say that they would one day reopen it if any hard evidence were to ever come up, but I think after 52 years, we will just never truly know just who D.B. Cooper was. And to be honest, I really don't want to know who he was because that would just end the mystery. Because a large part of the fun surrounding this mystery is just simply not knowing. And that's what really made this case legendary, is that simple fact that we just don't know. But I'm kind of rambling now. I'm going to wrap this up. Once again, this is Mike. This is Urban Legends and Mythology, and I truly thank you all for listening. So far, season 4 is going strong. So like I always say, if you want to help this show grow, reach out to me, reach out to the Instagram page, the Facebook page. It's just Urban Legend and Mythology at Instagram or Facebook. This stuff also does get uploaded to YouTube. I don't really pay attention to it because I think there's only like 300 views total or whatever since I started uploading it to YouTube. But if you want to give me some feedback or constructive criticism, that's probably the best place for it. It's where I'm most likely to see it, mostly just because it'll ping my phone instantly, and I try to respond to just about everything I can. I mean, I am sometimes crunched for time. Like I said, I do have a day job. Also, if you do want want to support the show in any kind of like monetary way, there is that support this podcast link down in the description of every episode. You people who are already doing that, you're like the primary ones that are keeping this show afloat right now. But if you don't want to do that, I get it. Money's tight in the world right now. But if you still want to support the show, you can always just tell a friend. This show is literally on almost every platform that hosts podcasts, I think. So it's getting easier to find every day. So once again, I do thank you for listening. I truly appreciate it. And I will see you guys in the next episode.